Good Oncologist, Doctoring Lessons from the Art of Oncology by Emily Zaltz, B.S., Calliope Reeves, B.S., Harmony Famer, M.A., Aaron Batchelor, B.S., Megan S. Weaver, M.D., M.P.H., Ph.D., H.E.C.C., and Erica Kaye, M.D., M.P.H. Professional organizations and research initiatives uphold a description of expectations, achievements, and behavioral norms congruent with the idea that there is a shared standard for recognizing quality relative to the physician role. Research demonstrates that the general public often considers personality, social skills, communication, organization, professionalism, and ethical and moral behavior as key facets of being a good doctor. A physician's personality and medical skills, particularly their diagnostic and intervention abilities, are particularly endorsed as crucial attributes of good doctoring. Various guidelines, such as the CanMed's competency domains, have been developed to teach good doctoring skills to general medical trainees and physicians. Within the field of oncology, ASCO and the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education, ACGME, have established frameworks to assess trainee competencies with the goal of guiding best practices for cancer care physicians. However, data suggests that the public may hold role expectations of a good doctor that extend beyond the scope of current medical professionalism frameworks, and professional and educational competencies may not consistently predict high-quality doctoring practices. Recently, studies have characterized what it means to be a good patient and a good parent in pediatric oncology, and these data have been instrumental in helping cancer care professionals meet patient and family needs. Yet scientific exploration of what it means to be a good doctor in oncology remains sparse. The Art of Oncology, AOO section in JCO, representing one of the most highly read and impactful forums for generation and dissemination of narrative oncology content, is ideal for examining cancer care professionals' perceptions of high-quality doctoring in oncology. Established in 2000, the AOO section of JCO has been described as the soul of JCO, providing a humanizing counterpoint to the research that dominates oncology literature. Given this explicit focus on the aspirational dimensions of oncology practice as articulated by professionals and stakeholders within the field, the AOO section was selected as an evocative source to examine thematic drivers of our perception of the good oncologist. We analyzed narrative medicine essays published in the AOO section of the Journal of Clinical Oncology, JCO, between 2015, Volume 33, Issue 1, and July 2025, Volume 43, Issue 18, to describe the core values upheld by clinicians as underpinning best practices for oncologists, in accordance with the Reflexive Thematic Analysis Reporting Guidelines. Reflexive thematic analysis facilitates iterative, flexible generation of themes without constraining data in a predetermined framework. Two trained analysts independently immerse themselves in the AOO data, engaging in iterative cycles of in-depth paper reading and memo writing to deepen their familiarity with the content and begin to explore meaning-making in the data. Both analysts coded meaningful qualitative segments by identifying and creating drafts of initial key concepts found in the data. Team members iteratively revised concept labels and descriptions, and the analysts independently winnowed concepts into themes based on topical similarities of the concepts, synthesizing their thematic groupings into a unified thematic framework. We then reviewed the ACGME's adult and pediatric hematology oncology milestones and used a deductive process to search the texts for additional concepts referenced in the ACGME milestones that had not emerged during the previous inductive analysis. 203 papers from the AOO section were thematically analyzed. A total of 242 authors were represented, of whom 37 published more than one article. Data supplement online only. Slightly more than half, 57%, identified as female. Almost half, 42%, practiced as oncologists, with the remaining authors identifying as physicians from other specialties, medical trainees, researchers, patients, caregivers, and others. 49 discrete concepts were inductively derived and subsequently synthesized to generate 7 key themes characterizing the attributes of a good oncologist, including 1. Practices patient-centered care. 2. Cultivates meaningful relationships. 3. Communicates skillfully and authentically. 4. Exercises emotional intelligence. 5. Manages the burden of cancer care. 6. Welcomes varied mindsets. And 7. Pursues learning and leadership. Theme 1. Practices patient-centered care. The authors often described that a good oncologist provides comprehensive care focused on a patient's unique identity, values, and preferences. Authors noted that respecting patient autonomy, respecting patient values, providing holistic care, eliciting patient goals and wishes, individualizing care, practicing patient etiquette, exhibiting cultural competence, and an awareness of social determinants of health were paramount to quality care. As several authors noted, such care requires improvisation, individualization, and humanism. Theme 2. Cultivates meaningful relationships. AOO narratives expressed that a good oncologist builds, strengthens, and maintains relationships with patients and families throughout the illness course. Within this theme, the concepts of fostering relational continuity, finding common ground, building trust and rapport, encouraging social connection, and navigating familial relationships were central to good doctoring in oncology. Notably, authors described how meaningful relationships with patients with cancer and their families should span various healthcare events, including diagnosis, end-of-life care, and bereavement support. Theme 3. Communicates skillfully and authentically. The authors suggested that a good oncologist shares information mindfully, compassionately, and directly while eliciting patient perspectives through listening, verbal communication, and nonverbal communication. Authors highlighted the importance of attentively and actively listening, embracing narrative medicine, using technology in moderation, bearing witness, honesty and transparency, mindfulness of word choice, and demonstrating compassion. Notably, several narratives describe that oncologists should avoid combative language and be cautious of sharing statistics and medical jargon during clinical communication. Theme 4. Exercises emotional intelligence. The authors describe that a good oncologist understands and regulates their emotions effectively. The concepts of demonstrating confidence and courage and maintaining humility were presented as integral to good oncologic practice. Moreover, feeling empathy, being genuine and vulnerable, practicing patience, sharing humor and joy, showing emotional expressiveness and resolve, feeling fulfillment from one's profession, and being adaptable and resilient were emphasized as crucial humanistic traits to good doctoring in cancer care. Theme 5. Manages the burden of cancer care. The authors emphasize that a good oncologist uses coping mechanisms to prevent physician burnout and maintain a balance between oncology and personal life. The concepts of navigating role conflict and compartmentalizing were recognized by authors as helpful strategies to maintain their work-life balance. Additionally, the concepts of creating space for grief and remembrance, seeking support, and practicing self-care were described as a helpful mechanism by which to maintain wellness and longevity in oncology. Theme 6. Welcomes varied mindsets. Prevalent throughout these essays was the idea that a good oncologist is open-minded to pluralism and diverse lenses of care. Important mindsets to good oncologic practice that authors shared included recognizing the impact of cancer care, appreciating the fragility of life, maintaining hope and realism, taking a day-by-day approach, embracing palliative care, embracing uncertainty, and navigating ethical issues. Furthermore, many articles describe the concept of supporting a multidisciplinary approach to care. Theme 7. Pursues learning and leadership. The authors described a good oncologist as someone who maintains a commitment to personal and professional growth while providing guiding expertise. The concepts of participating in mentorship, lifelong learning, engaging in personal reflection and introspection, creatively problem-solving, being a trailblazer, being an advocate, providing therapeutic, supporting, and guiding expertise, making difficult decisions, mastering technical skills and medical knowledge, and disseminating scholarly products were all identified as skills, experiences, or qualities of the good oncologist. Learning from personal hardship was also discussed as a quality that informed good doctoring. When we re-reviewed narrative essays focusing on ACGME oncology curricular milestones, we identified the following concepts: mastery of technical skills, expertise in medical knowledge, disseminates scholarly products, and navigates medical ethics. The ACGME concepts of professionalism, independent well-being, patient safety, and resource management were not specifically identified in the essays, however. The themes identified in the AOO provide the scaffolding for future development of a narrative-driven framework for identifying, assessing, and studying the concept of high-quality doctoring in oncology. These data also reveal actionable opportunities for expansion of existing graduate medical education rubrics, performance metrics, and professional guidelines in the field of oncology. Notably, the conceptualization of a good doctor in oncology largely aligns with existing competencies of the good doctor in general, while also offering opportunities for medical education leaders to improve metrics for high-quality medical practice in oncology. For example, current ACGME curricular milestones in hematology and oncology assess trainees on how well they independently manage their personal and professional well-being. Conversely, our findings suggest that many cancer care professionals believe that a good oncologist should develop strong support systems involving trusted colleagues, family, and mental health professionals rather than aim to independently manage their well-being. Aligning ACGME assessments with clinician perceptions of good doctoring may better promote physician sustainability and satisfaction in cancer care, replacing the current individualistic competency with communal ideals. Interestingly, professionalism is a key milestone in the ACGME guidelines and a core competency in the CanMEDS framework, yet this language was noticeably absent within the themes inductively generated from essays. However, certain concepts that might be reasonably categorized under professionalism, for example, patient etiquette, respect, and honesty, were present within the themes inductively generated. Given the recent dialogue around the removal of professionalism from oncology fellowship milestones, these findings offer a values-virtues role-based framework for conceptualizing the specific components of professionalism that underpin a good oncologist. Rather than undermining professionalism as a competency, our data illuminate its concrete manifestations, providing texture and specificity to ACGME guidelines. Several compassionate lenses for high-quality care provision also are not accounted for in existing ACGME guidelines. Our findings emphasize the importance of appreciating the fragility of life, balancing hope and realism, and embracing palliative care. Importantly, the authors recognize the importance of not gauging good oncologist practices in absolute or objective terms, as many pathways toward high-quality care exist. AOO essays may not have been designed or selected to describe good doctoring practices. Additionally, our findings may be influenced by selection bias for authors with personal or professional dispositions for writing and sharing narrative reflections. Specifically, this group of authors may exhibit shared tendencies in narrative content and construction that could skew the findings of this study toward a humanistic lens over a technical one. Furthermore, not all authors who choose to write and submit narrative stories to the AOO section of JCO will be selected for publication. Similarly, editors and reviewers of JCO may unconsciously prioritize essays that reflect a perception of good doctoring that may not be generalizable across the broader population of cancer care professionals. In summary, cancer care professionals carry internal definitions of what it means to be a good oncologist. Partnerships with key cancer community members are essential to integrate the perspectives of patients and caregivers into a framework to guide good doctoring in oncology. Opportunities exist to advance goalposts for medical training and professional career growth to align assessment tools with the core values of cancer care professionals.
Welcome back to JCO's Cancer Stories, The Art of Oncology. This ASCO podcast features intimate narratives and perspectives from authors exploring their experiences in oncology. I'm your host, Mikkael Sekeres. I'm professor of medicine and chief of the Division of Hematology at the Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center, University of Miami. What a pleasure it is today to have Erica Kaye, who's director of the Quality of Life and Palliative Care Research Program in the Department of Oncology at St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital, to discuss her Journal of Clinical Oncology article, The Good Oncologist, Doctoring Lessons from the Art of Oncology. At the time of this recording, our guest has no disclosures. We both have agreed to address each other by first names. Erica, thank you for contributing to Journal of Clinical Oncology and for joining us to discuss your article.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to be with you today.
And we're actually really grateful to have you. I was wondering if we could start by asking you about you. Can you tell us about yourself? Where are you from and what led you to this point in your life?
That is a very humbling question. And I suppose the Cliff Notes version is that I grew up in the DC area and always knew that I wanted to be a pediatric oncologist from a very young age. I went to college and studied English language and literature and poetry in specific, and then went to medical school where I discovered the intersection of communication and palliative care. And had no idea until that point that all of the stepping stones in my life had been leading me towards that point. But there was a really beautiful marriage in the ideas of thinking about caring for children with cancer in a very difficult journey, including at the end of life, and leaning into humanism and communication as an art and a procedural skill to best serve these patients and families. So now I am a pediatric oncologist and hospice and palliative medicine physician and researcher at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee.
Well, what an interesting journey that, at least the way you describe it, seems to lead seamlessly to your ultimate destination, recognizing that we often, as story writers, we make a good story for ourselves also in that journey.
There's always an editorial eye.
That's a great quote. I also think we've monopolized the market on physicians in oncology who were English majors who had some kind of focus like that for our Cancer Stories podcast series. Now, typically in Art of Oncology, we receive narrative essays, poems, or even other art forms as submissions. So in that sense, it was a little unusual for us to receive a submission that, in essence, analyzes our own content. Can you tell us what gave you and your co-authors the idea to explore Art of Oncology?
I am an enormous fan of the Art of Oncology. I think it is a beating pulse of humanism in our field and an incredible platform for people across our profession from many different disciplines and lived experiences to come together to reflect on meaning making in the cancer journey. And so I am always delighted to find unique and creative ways to leverage the Art of Oncology platform, and historically have had several submissions that were a little bit off the beaten path, but that was very purposeful because I think this is a remarkable forum that's incredibly well read and has the ability to spark conversation and move the needle. And we were really interested in this idea of the good oncologist, not in a vacuum, but because of historical context that over the last decade or so, there's been a growing and I think really beautiful and impactful literature around the idea of what it means to be a good parent in pediatric cancer. And then as an offshoot more recently, what it means to be a good patient. And I think that these fields of knowledge generation are more than just intellectually or theoretically interesting. They're incredibly clinically relevant and immediately actionable and impactful at the bedside. Because if we don't understand the true meaning and drive behind what an individual ascribes to their personhood as good parenting, there's no chance that we can create a real and sustained therapeutic alliance to facilitate decision making and mitigate decisional regret and truly support a family, particularly in the setting of advanced or treatment refractory cancer. And so the literature around good parent and good patient has, I think, been very impactful in our field. And there was little to nothing written in a scholarly way around what it means to be a good doctor in oncology. So that felt like an opportunity for us.
It's amazing that you thought about that nugget of truth or those nuggets of truth that could be buried in our content over years, really over a decade. So, how did you do it? How did you go about planning this study and trying to distill those nuggets from a lot of publications over years?
So I want to open by saying, give credit where credit is due. I was mentoring a remarkable undergraduate student and a remarkable medical student over the summer. And I had several large research studies ongoing that they were taking part of, and they were very productive. And so I sat down with them and said, I've always wanted to think about this idea of what it means to be a good doctor. Are you up for it? This is going to be very different from what you're currently doing. And they were eager and motivated. And so I had already been teaching them fundamentals of qualitative research. And so we applied those fundamentals, and in particular, a form of methodology called reflexive thematic analysis. And we were purposeful about looking back a decade. That is about roughly a little less than half the length, the history of the art of oncology. But that generated more than 200 essays of recent mind. So these are individuals within the last 10 years really reflecting on issues that are deeply connected to them around their humanism in the field. And there are a million different ways that you could do an inductive qualitative analysis, meaning going into the raw data and allowing the data to teach you whatever is there. But we wanted to look a little more focused at the question of what does it mean to be a good doctor when caring for patients and families affected by cancer. And so within the scope of that question, we looked inductively at all of the different concepts that arise. And we had a research team of multiple individuals from different backgrounds representing anthropology and psychology, palliative care, cancer care, and ethics. There's different steps in reflexive thematic analysis, but the big picture is that you immerse yourself in the content. You do memo writing, meaning that you write down everything that comes to mind around what questions does this inspire for you? Where might you have confusions? What feels important to you and why? And then from those memos, the team comes together to distill what are the main concepts, discrete concepts that are arising without overlap. And we found almost 50 discrete concepts and then sat down for, I think, the most fun process, which is synthesizing that information to generate knowledge. So what are we learning? How can we honor the voices of those individuals who've gifted a part of themselves to us to teach us something? How can we do justice by their voice when we synthesize a story in a concise but compelling way? And we landed with 7 main themes around how we as cancer care professionals, as well as others in our field affected by cancer, how do we conceptualize what it means to be a good oncologist? And then lastly, we felt it was important to have a deductive component to the analysis, where we actually looked at the ACGME guidelines for what we as structured, formal oversight institutions believe a trainee must have in order to be, quote unquote, a good oncologist, and then compared with curiosity and an open mind where there might be overlap and or variance or gaps between those formal guidelines and what we living in the field believe it means to be a good oncologist. And we found a lot of overlap and some opportunities for reflection in those points of disconnect.
So I wonder if I could geek out a little bit on the methodology. I've done some qualitative and quantitative research as well. I can imagine that as you're starting to go through the essays, you pull out some themes that people reflect on in their writing. And as you move along, you pull out additional themes and then say to yourself, gee, wait a second, I may have seen this before in one of those first essays that I read. Was there an opportunity for people to go back to the first essays to then capture those themes that at first they thought may not have been as systemic as they realized they were later on?
Absolutely. And it's a little bit of a semantic point, but we do that at the memo writing and the concept generation phase. So before we get anywhere close to synthesizing themes, we are on a rolling basis evaluating and then reevaluating all the concepts that are arising. And so you're exactly right. You might see a concept that feels meaningful and then see it 2 essays later, and then 10 essays later, and then 12 essays later. And that's reinforcing not only the prevalence of that concept, but it's also helping to refine that concept because sometimes you're seeing actually it's the exact same thing that people are saying with quite a bit of granularity and specificity. And that allows you to narrow the language you're using to really capture that concept. And conversely, sometimes as you see a concept emerge across a number of texts, you might see that there are nuances, differences that are all reflecting a very similar message, but with different shades of granularity. And that actually inspires us often to broaden the language we're using in that concept to make sure that we are honoring all of those nuances as we capture it under that umbrella. And those are the almost 50 concepts that we found that we did not codify until we had gone through every text multiple times. And once we had that body of concepts, then we sat down to generate themes.
So, when you had those 50 concepts, was there a way to quantitatively say this concept appeared out of those 200 articles in 35% of them and this one in 32% of them? Was that how you winnowed down the 50 to 7 to find the most prevalent concepts? Or was there another way that you had this Sophie's choice of incredible demonstration of awesome oncologists and brought it down to the critical 7?
That is such an important question. So, first, I want to appreciate you for asking it. A lot of people imagine qualitative research through a quantification of the qualitative science lens. And there is absolutely a reason and time to use that approach. I've used it actually quite frequently in my research, especially when I come at texts with a deductive question. So, for example, my research looks at how we talk about prognosis in advanced cancer. And so sometimes I really want to quantify the qual. How many times are we making a curability statement across many thousands of minutes of recorded dialogue? At other times, we really want to do justice to all the concepts that emerge without pitting them against each other or weighing them. And I think in this case, it was actually quite important to me to not to try to ascribe a weight or stratification of importance or gravitas to these concepts, because just because a concept was mentioned 10 times as opposed to 5 times does not make it twice as important. And so we used more of a principle similar to saturation in this setting. And saturation is a methodologic approach that's more specific to content analysis or thematic analysis, but has pertinence in reflexive thematic analysis. And basically, what it means is that you're going to continue generating concepts until there are no more concepts to generate. And when you have reviewed multiple texts and you are not identifying new concepts, you know that your conceptual model is saturated. And obviously, the more discrete and specific you get, the more concepts you will have ad nauseum, potentially to infinity. And so we are purposeful about saying, we're not going to say to be a good doctor means this specific type of communication in this specific way at this specific time, because if you use that level of granularity, you will generate concepts forever. But if you are saying communication is a main concept that we are looking at, or some facet of communication, it's actually quite affirming and remarkable how quickly we saturate, because we are living similar experiences, thinking about similar questions. And so we felt fairly confident that those 49 concepts that we generated were reflective of all of the dialogue offered to us in those 200 plus texts, specific to the question that we were focusing on.
Well, we're at a bit of a cliffhanger here. So, what are the major concepts that you found that define us as good oncologists?
So I will point our listeners to the paper for all of the concepts because I feel like it might not be fun for me to list 49 discrete concepts, but I'll share the 7 key themes that we generated, which characterize the attributes of a good oncologist from the perspectives of those affected by cancer care. And stepping back for a moment, I'll share that there were almost 250 authors represented because there were a couple dozen authors with multiple papers within this Art of Oncology section. And as a quick bird's eye view of demographics, about half were female, almost half self reported as oncologists, and the remaining authors identified as either physicians from other specialties or trainees or researchers. And then there were a handful of patients and caregivers as well. Those are the voices that we are synthesizing. The 7 key themes of a good oncologist from those perspectives were that a good oncologist practices patient-centered care, cultivates meaningful relationships, communicates skillfully and authentically, exercises emotional intelligence, manages the burden of cancer care, welcomes varied mindsets, and pursues learning and leadership. And those were the inductive themes. So the raw data generated those themes. We did not go in with a priori hypotheses or expectations for the data. But then when we went back and did a subsequent deductive analysis, we used as our framework the ACGME oncology curricular milestones. In doing that, we found a lot of overlap and found that some of the ACGME concepts, in particular, professionalism, independent well-being, patient safety, and resource management, were not identified as concepts in the essays. We found that interesting and think that there are some reflection points and takeaway messages from those data.
What did you learn from this project and how will it influence your own practice?
As somebody, I'll own my own bias that I consider myself to be a proponent of narrative medicine and narrative-based practice. And I think that the themes identified in this past decade of Art of Oncology essays can provide the scaffolding for us to think really mindfully about how we develop narrative-driven frameworks for identifying, assessing, and studying what it means to be a good doctor in oncology or a good clinician in oncology. For me, one of the most interesting findings was one, the way in which our curricular milestones really hammer this idea that a trainee needs to understand how to independently manage their well-being. And that was counter to the themes that we found in these essays, where most people perceived a good doctor to be somebody who partners with their trusted colleagues and families and mental health professionals and develop strong support systems. And the lessons that they learned was around the importance of not independently managing their well-being. So I think there's an opportunity for us to reflect on how we might tweak or in some ways rethink that curricular milestone. And then I think the fact that we did not see language around professionalism in these essays, I think is really important for us to reflect on. And it's not that there aren't concepts that would be reasonably categorized under professionalism that came out in these 49 concepts, but particular in this moment in time where there is ongoing dialogue around how the utility of professionalism within milestones. I think our findings offer what we consider to be a values, virtues, role-based framework for how we conceptualize the specific components of professionalism. So how can we break this out for trainees to help empower them and affirm their drive towards humanism as how they understand professionalism and being a good doctor?
I love the notion that we're not practicing in a vacuum, and it's such a privilege to be surrounded with such brilliant colleagues who are experts in so many different areas of oncology, including not only how we manage patients, but how we also care for ourselves. It's a beautiful way of ending this as well. Erica, it has been such a pleasure to have you here. Dr. Erica Kaye is Director of the Quality of Life and Palliative Care Research Program in the Department of Oncology at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, and she has been discussing her essay, The Good Oncologist, Doctoring Lessons from the Art of Oncology. Erica, thank you so much for submitting your article and for joining us today.
It is my honor. Thank you so much for elevating this dialogue. We appreciate it.
If you've enjoyed this episode, consider sharing it with a friend or colleague, or leave us a review. Your feedback and support helps us continue to have these important conversations. If you're looking for more episodes and context, follow our show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen, and explore more from ASCO at asco.org/podcasts. Until next time, this has been Mikkael Sekeres for JCO Cancer Stories, The Art of Oncology.
The purpose of this podcast is to educate and to inform. This is not a substitute for professional medical care and is not intended for use in the diagnosis or treatment of individual conditions. Guests on this podcast express their own opinions, experience, and conclusions. Guest statements on the podcast do not express the opinions of ASCO. The mention of any product, service, organization, activity, or therapy should not be construed as an ASCO endorsement.